Welcome back to On the Record, my friends. And on the record today, I'm going to share another children's record from the Children's Record Guild. And it is called Silly Will, and it is a silly song story that was written by Lucy Sprague Mitchell. And the music was by Harold Gable, and it was told and sung by Norman Rose, David Pfeiffer, and Sally Ann Lee Sweetland. As I pointed out on the one the other day that we did Little Pedro, the artwork is just, I love the artwork on these vintage children's records. It just is so cool. Had a quality that just, says this, I'm from the late 1940s, early 1950s. Unique art style. Let me tell you a little bit about the record from the blurb on the back, okay? Silly Will is a story which uses a simple device to tie together many isolated but familiar facts. Lucy Sprague Mitchell introduces the story from the Here and Now storybook that had been published by L.P. Dutton with the following statement: I have never found that children did not readily discriminate the actual from the imaginary. A lot of adults have trouble doing that today. Gosh, sometimes I think I do too. Anyways, in this story, the child learns about the vegetable, animal, and mineral kingdoms and their useful places in our society. Yet absorbing story is not sacrificed to encyclopedic knowledge, as Mrs. Mitchell herself writes. It is the function of a story to raise inquiries, not to give instruction. I'd agree with that. A story must stimulate, not merely inform. In Silly Will, the material of the story is familiar cows, sheep, horses, apples, pears, cucumbers, lumber, shoes, shirts, etc., and a very annoying goat. All parts of the vegetable and animal kingdom, only the relationships appear new, and to add to the child's increased understanding of more abstract ideas, the whole is a delightful musical adventure, and it is, and I think you'll enjoy it. It's a fun story, and I'm going to play that for you in just a second. Programming note, if you will. Today is Wednesday. On Friday, the 13th, I am going to be doing a special interview at Bill and Judy Wegner's Records and Tapes Galore here in Saginaw, Michigan, and I will be interviewing Tim Brennan, who owned and operated a pirate radio station in Bay City, Michigan, just north of me, back in the 1980s. And I think that should be a really interesting interview. So that'll be on the record Friday, so it'll probably come to you either Sunday or Monday next week. And then, I tell you what, why don't you sit back, relax, and listen to Silly Will on the record. God bless you. Love you all. Here we go.
Up the road and over the hill, out for a walk went Silly Will. The cow in the meadow winked an eye when Silly Will went walking by. The sheep on the hillside watched him pass and went right back to nibbling grass. And out in the pasture a galloping horse stopped at the fence and said, of course, one really should say good morning. Still, there's no use talking to Silly Will.
And sad enough, that was true. For Silly Will had the silliest ideas. That morning, as he walked along the road, he met an old lady sitting by the roadside, and she was sighing. Silly Will stopped and asked,
Why are you sighing, old lady?
Yesterday my brown cow wandered away, and today I lost my sheep. I don't know what to do. I depend on my cow for milk, and I depend on the sheep for wool for my clothing.
Depend on cows and sheep? Of all the silly things I ever heard.
Well, perhaps that's easy for you to say, but...
That's what the old lady began to say, but a voice strangely like a sheep's voice answered for her.
Well, Silly Will, if you think that about us, perhaps we'll just let you do without us.
But Silly Will didn't hear that, and he went walking along the high road until he met an old man sitting tired and worried by the roadside. Silly Will stopped and asked him about it.
What's the matter, old man?
I lost my horse. I don't know what I can do without him. I need him to work my farm and pull the wagon. I depend on that horse.
Depend on him? What silly people. Depend on cows, sheep, horses. Why, I can get along perfectly well without them.
Well, if that's what you think. That's what the old man began to say, but a voice strangely like a horse's voice finished for him. If you mean what you say, then perhaps it won't grieve you if all the animals should suddenly leave you. And the old man added something to that. Yes, may all your silly wishes come true. I hope all the animals of the animal kingdom leave you, and then perhaps you'll understand a little. And that night, as he slept, off came his blanket. Out the window flew his woolen pajamas. What's happening? What's happening? Cried Silly Will, and he heard a sound like the bleating of the old lady's sheep.
I take back my wool.
Oh, cried Silly Will, you can't do that. But as he was saying it, he seemed to drop down on the spring of his bed. Something had happened to the stuffing of his mattress, and he heard a voice like the neighing of the old man's horse.
I take back my horsehair.
Whatever can this be? Screamed Silly Will, and he jumped out of bed to put on his clothes. All he could find were his cotton underwear and cotton socks. And when he reached for his shoes, away they went. And he heard a voice, strangely like the voice of the lost brown cow.
I take back my leather.
It was morning then, and Will decided he might just as well go downstairs for his breakfast. But when he reached the pantry door and opened it, it squeaked like a faraway barnyard. Hens, pigs, cows, all the animal kingdom was leaving Silly Will. At last he found a dry soda cracker left in a box and sat down, foolishly dressed as he was, to eat his silly meal. But even then he didn't quite understand. I'll show them, he said. I can still get along perfectly well without them. And true enough, for a short time he did.
Yes, all through the summer, Silly Will wore cotton clothing and ate his fill. Peas and beans and green cucumber grew in his garden without number until the autumn came around and the garden withered on the ground. His meals grew scanty and Will grew thinner until one night he had nothing for dinner.
Well, then, I'll go out and borrow something to eat, said Silly Will. And he went down the road until he came again to the old lady's house and knocked at the door.
Come in, Silly Will.
Can you let me have something to cook for my dinner? You see, there's nothing left in my garden.
Yes, food's hard to keep over the winter, but I have a few dried peas here and some dried apples.
Peas and apples indeed. No, thank you. I can get along perfectly well without them.
Well, if that's how you feel about it.
That's what the old lady began to say, but an old dried apple voice answered for her.
No vegetable dinner, no apple or duff. Well, Silly Will, that's easy enough.
And then he came to the old man's house, and his woods were all burned down. Come in, Silly Will.
I'm sorry to see your woods burned down.
Yes, I depended on that firewood to keep me warm.
Depended? You people always depending on things. On vegetables. On wood. I can get along perfectly well without them.
Well, Silly Will, if that's what you want. That's what the old man began to say, but an angry voice answered for him.
If that's what you want, then perhaps it won't grieve you if all the vegetables suddenly leave you.
And the old man had something to add to that, too. Yes, I hope your silly wish comes true. I hope all the vegetable kingdom leaves you, too, and then perhaps you'll understand a little. And no sooner had the old man said that than Silly Will's cotton shirt flew off his back, and he heard a plant voice saying,
I take back my cotton.
"Oh, I'm so cold," cried Silly Will, and he ran home faster and faster. But just as he got to the door of his house, his whole house collapsed, and he heard the voice of the forest saying,
I take back my lumber!
Yes, only the brick chimney and the pipes and the nails were left. "Oh," cried Silly Will, "what shall I do? I can't live like this. I'm only a little boy, and I can't live all alone in the mineral kingdom." And then the ground he was lying on seemed to begin to shake too, and he heard voices saying,
We've come back to you, Will.
"Come back to you.
We've come back to you, Will.
I'm so glad," said Will. "I must have been dreaming."
Yes, up the high road and over the hill, walking again went Silly Will. The cow in the meadow winked an eye and moved when Silly Will went by. The sheep on the hilltop nibbling grass said baa and watched him pass. And out in the pasture a galloping horse stopped at the fence and said, of course, he's silly no more. So he stood quite still and neighed through the morning, hello there, Will.